The signal was wrong before I even finished reading it. Not wrong like a formatting error. Not wrong like a corrupted packet or a busted relay beacon 3 systems out. Wrong like finding a door in a wall that has never had a door. Wrong like hearing your name spoken in a room you thought was empty. I was alone on the signals deck of the GCU Persistence, 6 hours into a 14-hour shift, drinking my third coffee and scanning the overnight noise logs when it appeared. A tight beam transmission, narrow, precise, deliberate, locked onto a frequency that no registered civilization in the galactic concordat used, not even close to any of them. The frequency was not in our reference tables. It was not in the backup tables. It was not in the archive tables that nobody had updated since before I was born. It simply did not belong to anyone we knew. My name is Kale Morrow. I am 31 years old. I hold the rank of Specialist, Xenolinguist Division, Signals Analysis. I have spent 6 years aboard the Persistence listening to the quiet hum of a galaxy that mostly keeps to itself. I have decoded 17 first contact signal candidates in my career. 16 of them turned out to be natural phenomena, pulsars, magnetar bursts. One memorable case that turned out to be 2 gas giants in tidal resonance, doing something mathematically beautiful and completely meaningless. This was not that. The signal had structure. I could see it immediately in the waveform readout, the way you can see intent in handwriting before you understand the words, repeating intervals, internal rhythm, layered carrier frequencies that nested inside each other like boxes inside boxes. Someone had thought very carefully about how to build this signal. Someone had wanted it to be noticed. I ran the Concordat cross-reference. The database returned a result in 0.4 seconds, which is standard. The result read, no match found. I ran it again with broader parameters. No match found. I expanded the search to include inactive civilizations, extinct species logs, per-contact survey echoes, even the theoretical signal profiles we kept on file for hypothetical non-biological intelligence. Nothing. The signal did not exist in any record we had. Whatever was sending, it had never, in the entire documented history of Concordat exploration, said hello to anyone. That alone should have been enough to wake the senior staff. I almost reached for the alert panel. I stopped because of what happened next. The signal shifted. Not degraded, not drifted. It shifted with purpose, the way a sentence shifts when a new clause begins. The rhythm changed. The nested frequencies reorganized. And then, deep inside the new pattern, I found something that made my coffee go cold in my hand. A coordinate string. Not encoded. Not buried under layers of mathematical cipher. Just there, sitting inside the signal structure as plainly as a street address written on an envelope. Stellar coordinates, a specific system. I pulled up the Concordat star charts and cross-referenced the numbers. The system existed. It was cataloged. Survey designation NC7714, logged 812 years ago by an early exploration vessel. The chart entry was 3 lines long. It said, surveyed uninhabited class 4 dead zone, no resources of interest, no follow-up recommended. Someone had been there 8 centuries ago, decided there was nothing worth looking at and moved on. I sat with that for a long moment. The signal was coming from a dead zone that nobody had visited in over 800 years. It was broadcasting on a frequency nobody used. It was structured with obvious intelligence, and it had, somehow, left its address in plain sight as if it had been waiting for someone to find it and wanted to make sure they knew where to look. I filed an immediate priority flag and sent it up to Lieutenant Commander Petra Voss on the command deck. I included every data point. I included my analysis. I included a clear statement that this warranted investigation. I sat back in my chair and watched the acknowledgement ping come back 11 minutes later. It read, logged, under review, continue standard monitoring. I stared at that response for a long time. Continue standard monitoring. As if this were a weather report. As if I had flagged an interesting cloud formation and they were nodding it for the seasonal records. I went back to the signal. I went back because I had nothing else to do and because I could not stop looking at it. There was something almost magnetic about the waveform on my screen. I kept finding new layers the longer I stared. Deeper frequencies underneath the main carrier. Patterns inside patterns. The signal was not just structured. It was rich, dense. It had the feeling of a language that had been refined over a very long time. The way ancient writing systems look nothing like modern ones, and yet carry the same weight of accumulated thought. I started a translation matrix, not because I expected results, because it was the thing I knew how to do, and the thing in front of me was the kind of problem I had trained my whole life to sit with. I set up the matrix, fed it the signal parameters, and let it run. While it ran, I pulled the original survey report for NC 7714, 812 years old, written in the dry, clipped style of early exploration vessels that were paid by the system surveyed and had no interest in lingering. The surveying officer was a man named Captain Frederick Oates, long dead. His report said the system had 1 star, 4 planets, no breathable atmosphere on any of them, no detectable artificial structures, no electromagnetic emissions of artificial origin. Nothing there. Move on. Nothing there. I looked at the coordinate string embedded in the signal. I looked at the survey report. I thought about 800 years and what could happen in 800 years to a system that a tired captain with a quota to meet had glanced at once and declared empty. Then the translation matrix chimed. It had not translated the signal. That would have taken weeks, maybe longer, with a structure this complex and an unknown language base. What it had done was find one fragment, one small piece of the signal architecture that matched something in our databases. Not a language, a reference marker, a specific type of coordinate notation that several early Concordat civilizations had used in their own signal protocols before standardization. The marker was old, older than the survey, older than the Concordat itself. Whatever was using it had either borrowed an ancient format or had been transmitting since before humanity had ships. I reached for the alert panel. My hand was 6 centimeters from it when the signal stopped. Complete silence. The waveform on my screen flatlined. The frequency went dead. I held my breath. I checked my instruments. Nothing wrong with our receivers. Nothing wrong with the relay network. The signal had simply ended. 3 seconds passed. I counted them. Then the signal came back. Same frequency, same structural architecture, but the content had changed entirely. The layered patterns were gone. In their place was something so simple that my translation matrix flagged it before I even asked it to. Plain language, human language, standard Concordat common tongue, the same language I was thinking in. 5 words. We see you, persistence. Do not come closer. I did not move for a very long time. I sat in my chair on a signals deck that suddenly felt much smaller than it had an hour ago, and I read those 5 words over and over until they stopped looking like words and started looking like a wall. It knew our name, not humanity, not the Concordat, our ship. The GCU Persistence, one of 460 vessels in the Concordat survey fleet, a mid-range signals analysis ship with a crew of 93, currently running a routine patrol in a sector that nobody cared about. It knew we were here. It had been waiting for someone to notice its signal, and now that someone had, it was telling us in our own language, with perfect clarity and no room for misunderstanding, to stay away. I hit the alert panel, every alert panel on the deck. I opened a direct channel to Commander Voss and I told her, word for word, what I had just read. I told her to look at my screen feed. I told her to wake Admiral Voss in the senior quarters because this was not a weather report and it was not going in the seasonal records. The command deck lights came on. Feet hit floors. Voices overlapped in the corridor outside. I looked back at my screen. The 5 words were still there, perfectly still, like a door that had just swung open in a wall that had never had a door. And on the other side of it, something very old and very patient was standing in the dark, watching us decide what to do next. I already knew what the Concordat would decide. They would send the fleet. They always sent the fleet. That was the thing about being scared that nobody at the top ever wanted to admit. When you do not understand something, when it sits outside every record and every category and every comfortable explanation, the instinct is not to listen. The instinct is to show up with everything you have and make the unknown thing feel small. I filed a formal recommendation against military response within the next 20 minutes. I cited the deliberate use of language. I cited the restraint implied in a warning rather than an attack. I cited every principle of xenolinguistic protocol that I had studied for 6 years. The recommendation was logged. Nobody read it. I know because 3 weeks later, when the orders came in and I saw the scale of what they were planning to send, I checked the access record on my file. 0 reads. Not one person in the chain of command had opened it. The Armada was already being assembled. 47 ships, the largest single deployment of Concordat military force in 3 centuries. Carriers, destroyers, long-range artillery platforms, a full electronic warfare division, and 2 colony-grade support vessels to handle the logistics of a sustained engagement. Sustained engagement. Those were the actual words in the deployment brief. They were going to knock on a door they did not understand, and they were going to do it with their fist. And I, the only person on the Persistence who had actually talked to whatever was behind that door, was being reassigned to the task force as the xenolinguist attachment. Because somebody, somewhere in the command structure, had at least the minimal foresight to know they might eventually need someone to translate. I packed my kit. I transferred to the flagship. I sat in my bunk on the first night and reread those 5 words one more time before I closed my eyes. We see you, Persistence. Do not come closer. I thought about Captain Frederick Oates and his 3-line survey report and his nothing there. I thought about 800 years. I thought about a signal structure dense enough to take weeks to decode, and a civilization patient enough to wait inside a dead zone until someone finally noticed. Whatever was out there had been watching the galaxy for a very long time. It had seen us coming. It had tried to tell us to stop. We were not going to stop. I knew that the moment I saw the fleet manifest. 47 ships and a deployment brief that used the word engagement. We were not going to stop, and I was going to be there when we did not stop, and the only thing I could hold onto was the hope that something patient enough to wait 800 years might also be patient enough to forgive the very loud, very frightened species knocking on its door with both fists. I did not sleep well that night. I did not sleep well for many nights after. But I kept my notes. I kept every record. Because if things went wrong, I wanted there to be one honest account of what actually happened out there, told by the one person who had been listening when everyone else was preparing to speak. We dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of NC 7714 at 600 hours, ship time. I was on the command deck of the flagship GCU Valor. Admiral Harold Crane stood at the forward display with his hands behind his back, and his jaw set in the particular way that senior officers set their jaws when they have decided that whatever happens next will be controlled and decisive, and will go into the history records favorably. I stood near the back of the room, beside Lieutenant Commander Petra Voss, who had been reassigned from the Persistence to the task force at the same time I had. She was the only other person on the entire flag deck who had read my recommendation against the deployment. She had not agreed with me exactly, but she had read it, which already put her in a category of her own. The forward display populated as our sensor array came online. The system resolved itself piece by piece, the way a photograph develops in an old chemical bath. 1 star, yellow-white, middle-aged, healthy. 4 planets in relatively standard orbital positions. And then the 5th thing on the display. The thing that the sensor array hesitated on for almost 4 full seconds before it committed to rendering. The thing that Captain Frederick Oates had not seen 800 years ago, because it had not been there 800 years ago. Or perhaps it had been there, and it had simply chosen not to be visible. It was not a planet. I want to be precise about that because the word structure does not carry enough weight, and the word ship carries entirely the wrong implications. What our sensors were rendering on that display was an object approximately 11,000 kilometers in diameter that completely enclosed the system's star. Not orbiting it, not near it, around it. The entire star was inside this thing, the way a lamp is inside a lampshade, except the lampshade in this case was larger than most planets and showed no visible seams, no obvious hull plating, no propulsion signatures, no weapons arrays, no docking ports, no communication antennae that our sensors could identify. It absorbed light at certain frequencies and emitted it at others. From a distance, in the right spectrum, it would look like nothing. It would look like empty space with a star behind it. It would look exactly like what Captain Frederick Oates had seen and noted as uninhabited and moved on from without a second thought. Someone behind me whispered something I could not make out. The command deck was very quiet. Even Admiral Crane had stopped arranging his jaw and was simply looking at the display with an expression I had not seen on his face before. It was the expression of a man who has been very confident about something for a long time and has just been handed a piece of information that the confidence was never accounting for. I opened my translation matrix on my personal terminal. I started monitoring the frequency we had detected on the persistence. The signal was there, running steady, the same structural architecture, the same layered density. It had not changed since the moment I first found it. It was continuous and unhurried, like a river that does not stop because you decide to come look at it. Admiral Crane recovered first. That is the thing about flag officers. They are trained to recover quickly from surprises because surprises in the field are expensive and hesitation is more expensive still. He turned to his tactical officer and he said 3 words. "Find me solutions." I stepped forward. I said, clearly and at a volume that the entire deck could hear, that I had a standing recommendation against offensive action on file, and that I requested permission to attempt a contact protocol before any tactical options were engaged. Crane looked at me the way senior officers look at linguists, the look that says, "I know why you are here and it is not for moments like this." He said he would take my recommendation under advisement and told me to stand by. I stood by, I kept my terminal open, I kept monitoring the signal. The tactical officer had firing solutions prepared inside 6 minutes. I will say this for the Concordat military. They are fast at the things they are trained to be fast at. 6 minutes from sensor confirmation of an unknown 11,000-kilometer structure enclosing a star to having weapons aimed at it. That is genuinely impressive in the worst possible way. Crane did not fire immediately. I will also give him that. He waited. He ordered a full sensor sweep first. He asked for structural analysis, for energy signature breakdowns, for any data that could tell him what he was looking at before he did anything to it. The analysis team worked for 22 minutes. At the end of 22 minutes, the lead analyst reported that the structure was unlike anything in Concordat records, that it appeared to be made of a material that did not match any known alloy or composite, that it was generating an internal energy field of a type that could not be classified with available instruments, and that there were no obvious points of weakness. That last part seemed to bother Crane more than anything else in the report. I made one more attempt. I walked to the front of the deck. I told Crane directly that the entity had already demonstrated the ability to communicate in human language, that it had done so without hostility, that the word it had used was a warning and not a threat, and that the difference between a warning and a threat was precisely the space in which diplomacy lived. I told him that walking into that space with weapons ready was the single best way to make the warning into something worse. Crane looked at me for a moment. I thought briefly that something in what I said had landed somewhere useful. He told me to return to my station. I returned to my station. He gave the order to advance the formation. All 47 ships, in full combat configuration, moving toward an 11,000-kilometer structure wrapped around a star like a fist around a candle. I kept my eyes on my terminal. I watched the signal frequency. I watched for any change in the transmission pattern, any sign that the thing ahead of us was responding to our approach. For 40 minutes, nothing changed. We moved through the outer edge of the system. The structure grew on the forward display until it occupied the entire lower half of the screen. Up close, the surface resolved into something almost organic in texture. Not plating, not panels, something smoother and more continuous, like the surface of water if water could be solid and 11,000 kilometers wide. Then the signal changed. Not the content, the direction. The tight beam transmission that had been broadcasting in a general forward direction shifted, in a single instant, to a precise lock on our flagship. Not the fleet, just the Valor, just us. The beam was so focused that our sensor array measured its width at less than half a meter at point of contact with our hull. My translation matrix flagged new content before I could even read the raw data. 12 words, in standard Concordat common tongue, perfect grammar, completely calm. You were warned, we will not harm your people. Watch. I stood up from my station. I said loudly that the signal had new content and that it was a direct address to the Valor, and that everyone on this deck needed to hear what it said. Crane turned. I read him the 12 words. He ordered full weapons to active status. 3 seconds after that order, the first ship on the left flank of our formation went dark. Not dark like a power failure, dark like a lamp that someone had clicked off. Every signal from it stopped simultaneously. Engines, communications, weapons systems, internal lighting, everything. The ship was still there, visible on the display. It just had nothing coming out of it. Then the second ship. Then the third. They went out in sequence, the way lights go out along a corridor when someone walks toward you from the far end and flicks each switch as they pass. Not rushed, not frantic, ordered. One by one, each ship in our formation simply ceased transmitting, ceased operating, ceased being anything more than a very expensive metal object drifting in space. I watched the counter on my tactical display. 47 ships, 46 transmitters going quiet. I watched the number fall. I watched it fall and I thought about 12 words in a warning 3 weeks old that nobody had read. It took 4 minutes and 19 seconds for 46 ships to go silent. Each one was clearly visible on the display. None of them had been struck by anything. No projectile, no energy beam, no shockwave. They had simply been turned off, the way you turn off a device you do not want making noise anymore. The Valor was still running, every system still live, life support nominal, the lights were on, the air was moving, I could still read my terminal. The coffee in my mug beside the station was still warm. Crane had not moved. He was standing at the front of the deck staring at the display where 46 dark shapes drifted in neat formation around our single-lit vessel. His tactical officer was checking and rechecking instruments that were all reading exactly the same thing. Normal. Our ship was normal. Every other ship in the fleet was not a ship anymore in any functional sense. And then my terminal chimed one more time. One more message on the locked frequency, still addressed only to us. 7 words. The one who warned you, send them. I looked up from my screen. Every face on the command deck was looking at me. Admiral Crane was looking at me. Petra Voss was looking at me with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite relief and lived somewhere in the difficult space between the two. Crane said nothing for a very long time. The deck was completely silent except for the background hum of systems running and the very faint sound of 46 ships drifting outside with nothing in them but darkness and still air and crews who were, I had to believe, still alive inside that darkness, still breathing, just waiting. Crane finally asked me one question. He asked it in a very quiet voice that I had not heard from him before in the 3 weeks I had been on his ship. He asked me if I thought they were still alive in there. I said yes. I said it with more certainty than I felt, because certainty was the only useful thing I could offer him at that moment. I said that something capable of building a structure around a star had no need to destroy 46 ships when it could simply stop them. I said that the message had not said anything about harm. I said that the warning had said they would not harm our people, and that I believed that was still the operational statement. Crane was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "Prepare a shuttle." He said it to the room, but he was looking at me. I said I would need my translation kit, my personal terminal, and approximately 20 minutes to write a first contact protocol brief to keep in my pocket for reference. Crane said I had 15. I had it done in 11. I am a professional. The shuttle was a standard survey craft. Single pilot bay, secondary passenger section, no weapons, no shielding above Class 2, designed for atmospheric entry and orbital survey work, and not, in any documentation I could find, designed for solo approach to an 11,000-kilometer artificial megastructure of completely unknown origin. I sat in the passenger section because I could not fly the thing myself, and because the pilot, a young ensign named Calvin Price, had been chosen specifically because he was the least senior flight crew member available, which I took to mean that Admiral Crane had done a rapid mental calculation about risk and decided that whatever happened to this shuttle, he could afford to lose a junior ensign more than he could afford to lose anyone with rank. I did not mention this to Calvin Price. He was 23 years old, had been in the fleet for 14 months, and was currently maintaining the specific professional expression of someone trying very hard not to show how loud their own heartbeat had become. I respected that. My heartbeat was doing the same thing. The Valor shrank behind us. I watched it on the rear camera feed until it was just a bright point among the stars, and then I turned around and looked at what was ahead. From the command deck display, the structure had looked enormous. From the shuttle, closing the remaining distance at survey speed, it was something else entirely. The word enormous does not scale to what I was looking at. A planet is enormous. A star is enormous. This thing was the size of a wrapping around a star, and it was ahead of me, and I was in a vehicle the size of a dining room, and the mathematics of those two facts took several minutes to fully process. The surface was not featureless up close. What had looked smooth from a distance resolved as we drew nearer into something more like texture than structure. Patterns ran across the surface in long, slow curves, the way grain runs through wood or current runs through water. They were not mechanical. They were not the repeating geometries of engineered plating. They looked grown. They looked like something that had formed over time rather than been assembled. I had my translation matrix open. The signal was still running steady on the locked frequency. No new content, just the ongoing transmission, that same dense layered architecture I had been looking at for 3 weeks, humming away like background music in a room you have stopped noticing. Calvin Price said nothing for the first 40 minutes of the approach. He did his job. He kept our heading steady, matched the approach vector that had been fed to us from the Valor's nav team, monitored the instrument panel with the careful attention of someone who understands that instrument panels are the only reliable thing in an unreliable situation. At 43 minutes, the surface ahead of us changed. A section approximately 300 meters wide began to differentiate from the surrounding material. It did not open. It did not slide or retract or hinge. It simply became different, the way a fog bank thins in one place when the wind shifts. Where there had been solid surface, there was now a passage. Calvin Price said quietly that the passage was there. I said yes. He asked if I wanted him to take us in. I said yes. He took us in. The passage had no visible walls, exactly. What bordered us on either side was a transition zone between outside and inside. A region where the material of the structure shifted from surface to something else, something ambient and faintly luminescent, as if the structure itself produced a dim light from within rather than reflecting it from without. There were no corridors in any architectural sense I was familiar with. What the passage opened into was more like a vast interior space, spherical and enormous, with no obvious ceiling and no obvious floor and a quality of depth that made it very difficult to judge distance to anything. In the center of that space, something was waiting. It did not look like a creature in the way I had been imagining creatures for 3 weeks. I had been imagining something biological, something with a body, something that would look at me with eyes and speak from a mouth. What was waiting in the center of that space was more like a density, a presence organized into a location rather than a form. I could see that it was there the same way you can see that a current is there in a river, not because the water looks different, but because things near it behave differently, because the space around it had a kind of orientation that pointed toward it regardless of where you were standing. And then it spoke, not through my translation matrix, not through any instrument, directly, in my head, in a way that was not a sound but carried every property of a sound including tone and pace, and the particular quality of careful enunciation that someone uses when they are speaking in a language that is not their own. It said, "You are the one who listened." I said yes, my voice came out steady, I was proud of that. It said the others heard, "You listened, there is a difference." I said I knew. There was a pause, not an uncomfortable pause, a considered one, the pause of something that has been alive long enough that it does not feel the need to fill silence. Then it said, "We have been here a very long time. We have watched your kind for most of that time. We have found you consistently difficult to understand." I asked why. It said, "Because you are afraid of almost everything and you keep going anyway." I did not know what to say to that. I stayed quiet. It said, "That is not an insult. In our experience, it is one of the stranger and more compelling qualities a civilization can have." Calvin Price, behind me, let out a slow breath that he had apparently been holding since we entered the passage. I did not blame him. I asked about the fleet. I asked about the 46 ships. The presence shifted. The density of it moved slightly, the way attention moves when someone turns to look at something they were already looking at from the corner of their eye. It said they are resting, all of them, exactly as they were. Time is not passing for them. We could not allow harm to come to them, and we could not allow them to make a mistake that they could not undo. I asked what kind of mistake. It said, "The kind your kind makes when it is very scared and has a great deal of firepower." It was kinder to pause things before that mistake happened. I thought about Admiral Crane, standing at the front of the command deck, watching ships go dark one by one. I thought about the expression on his face. I thought about what he must be doing right now, standing on the single lit ship in a formation of 46 dark ones, waiting for news from a survey shuttle carrying one linguist and a 23-year-old ensign. I asked what they wanted, what this meeting was for, what the signal, the warning, all of it had been pointing toward. The presence was quiet for a moment. When it spoke again, there was something in its tone that I would have called gentleness if I had been describing a human voice. It said, "We want to show you something, and we want to see if you are ready to look at it." I asked what it was. It said, "Yourselves." I said I did not understand. It said, "You will, but first I would like to ask you a question, a single question before anything else. It is the question we have asked every civilization that has reached us, every one, and your answer determines everything that follows." I steadied myself. I told it to ask. It said, "Why did you come here armed?" The question was simple. 4 words in the version my mind assembled from the impression of its voice. Why did you come here armed? Clean, direct, no edge to it. Just the question, hanging in that luminous interior space, waiting. I thought about the Concordat assembly. I thought about Admiral Crane and his jaw and his firing solutions and his 22 minutes of sensor analysis. I thought about my recommendation, 0 reads on the access log. I thought about the fleet manifest and the word engagement. And then I stopped thinking about all of that, and I said the only thing that was actually true. I said because we were scared. The space was very quiet. Then the presence did something I had not anticipated, something I had no category for in any first contact protocol I had ever read or written. It laughed. Not in a way I heard, in a way I felt. A deep, long, thoroughly genuine expression of something that was definitely amusement, possibly surprise, and carried with it the unmistakable quality of a creature that had been waiting a very long time for something and had just finally gotten it. The laughter went on for what felt like 2 full minutes. I looked back at Calvin Price. He looked at me. We shared the expression of two people who have no idea if what is happening is good news or the other kind. When the laughter finally settled, the President said, 71 civilizations. That is how many have found their way here. 71. Some found us, some we guided, some simply stumbled in the way your fleet did. We have asked each of them the same question. I asked what the other 70 had said. It said various things. The Solendi said they came to prevent a threat. The Cathara said it was standard procedure. Most gave answers that were technically true and fundamentally dishonest. Several said nothing at all and simply tried to fire on us, which was memorable if not illuminating. It paused. It said, not one of them said we were scared. I sat with that for a moment. I asked, what does that mean? For what happens next? The presence moved toward me, not physically, but in terms of attention and focus, and whatever it used instead of eyes. I felt the weight of something very old looking at something comparatively very young and finding it, despite everything, worth looking at. It said, it means you are the first conversation we have been able to have, and we have a very great deal to tell you, Kale Morrow. We have been saving it up for a very long time. Calvin Price made a small sound behind me that might have been the beginning of a sentence, or the end of a held breath, or simply the noise a person makes when the world turns out to be a great deal larger than advertised. I kept my eyes on the presence. I pulled out my notebook, old habit, paper and a pen because electronics fail and paper does not. I turned to the first empty page. I said, I am ready. And I meant it. For the first time since I found that signal 3 weeks ago in the middle of a night shift with my third coffee going cold, I was genuinely, completely ready. Not because I was not afraid anymore. I was still afraid. I was afraid in the way that you are afraid when you are standing at the edge of something so large that the rest of your life will be defined by what happens in the next few minutes. But the presence had said something true about my kind, without meaning it as a compliment but delivering it as one anyway. We are afraid of almost everything, and we keep going anyway. I kept going. What it told me first was not a story. It was a context, a frame that had to be built before anything could be hung on it, the way a house needs walls before you can talk about what is inside. I sat in that luminous, gravity-free interior space with my notebook open and my pen moving, and the presence, which I had begun to think of in my head by the name the Veil, began to explain what we were sitting in the middle of. The Veil were not one thing. That was the first and most important piece of context. What I had been calling a presence, what my mind had been shaping into the image of a single intelligence in a single location, was in fact a distributed network. Individual nodes, each fully conscious, each capable of independent thought and action, but connected to all the others at a level that made the word connected feel inadequate. They did not send signals to each other. They did not communicate in the way I communicated with Calvin Price by opening my mouth and moving air. They were, in some way I could feel the edges of but not fully grasp, simultaneous. What one knew, all knew. What one felt, all felt, though feeling was a word they used with some reluctance. The body I was near, the density in the center of the chamber, was one node. One among how many, I asked. It told me it did not count anymore. It had not counted in a very long time. The counting had stopped being meaningful. I asked where the others were. It said, here, and in every part of the structure, and in spaces outside the structure that you would not currently be able to perceive. I wrote that down. I kept writing. The structure, which I had been calling a megastructure in my head because I had no better word, was not primarily an engineering achievement. That was the second piece of context. From the outside, wrapped around a star, it looked like an act of enormous construction. And it had been constructed in the early period, when the Veil were still what I would recognize as a young civilization. But over time, the structure had been less built and more grown. The Veil had, Through a process I will not pretend I fully understood from a single conversation. Learn to interact with matter at a level where the distinction between building something and becoming something dissolved. The structure was, in some meaningful sense, part of them. Not a ship, not a home, a form. The way a shell is part of the animal that made it and lives in it and cannot fully be separated from it without changing what the animal is. I asked how old it was. The veil said, older than your species by a significant margin, older than several of the species your concordat records as ancient. I asked for a number. It gave me one, I wrote it down, I looked at what I had written, I turned the page. Then it told me about the 71. This was the part that changed something fundamental in the way I understood the galaxy I had been living in. I had grown up with the Concordat's model of the universe. Humanity at the center of a broad community of space-traveling civilizations, 43 species in formal contact, a couple hundred more at various stages of development, everybody broadly moving in the same direction of expansion and exploration and cautious cooperation. That model was not wrong, exactly. It just had a ceiling that nobody had told us about. Every civilization the Veil had observed, and they had been observing for a very long time, moved through a series of phases. The early phase was expansion. Ships, territories, resources, the fundamental drive of a young species that has just figured out how to leave its home system and wants to see how far the frontier goes. The Concordat was in this phase. Most of our 43 contact species were in this phase. It felt like progress because it was progress, just not the only kind. The second phase, which the Concordat had no name for because no Concordat member species had yet reached it, was what the Veil described as arriving at the question. The question was not a specific question. It was more like a recognition, a moment when a civilization becomes old enough and wise enough and has seen enough of the universe that it has to stop and confront something it has been too busy to confront in the expansion phase. The question of what it is actually for, not what it can do. Not how far it can go, what it is for. Most civilizations, the Veil said, found the question very difficult. I asked why. It said, because the answer, if you look at it honestly, is not what you expect. Civilizations expect the answer to be grand. They expect the universe to confirm that they are significant, that their expansion matters, that the territory they have claimed and the species they have encountered and the technologies they have built represent something important in the larger structure of things. And the honest answer is more complicated than that. The honest answer requires a kind of humility that young, expanding civilizations have spent their entire development learning to avoid. I asked about the Solendi, the ones who had walled themselves off with wormholes. The Veil said the Solendi had arrived at the question and decided they did not like it. They had built their borders and gone inward. They were still there, still functional, still alive in every technical sense, but they had closed. They had decided that the universe outside their walls was not worth engaging with on terms they could not control, and so they had removed the terms entirely. I asked if they were still out there now. The Veil said yes, and said that the Solendi had not changed in 7,000 years. A civilization that had once been dynamic and curious and alive in the way that young civilizations are alive, now perfectly preserved and perfectly static, like a very beautiful insect in a very old piece of amber. I thought about that for a long moment. I asked about the Cathara, the ones who had uploaded themselves. The Veil said the Cathara had taken a different road to the same place. They had decided that the biological form was the problem, that consciousness was being held back by the limitations of bodies and chemistry and the slow pace of organic thought. They had uploaded. They had become digital in a manner of speaking, existing now as information patterns in a network of their own construction. They were faster in many ways. They were more efficient. They no longer got sick or aged or died in the biological sense. They had also, the Veil said, essentially stopped. Not stopped moving, stopped changing. The upload had fixed them at a particular moment of their development, and without the friction of physical existence, without the pressure of limitation and mortality and the need to solve problems that could not wait, They had simply maintained themselves rather than grown. They were, in their own way, as static as the Solendi. Different kind of amber, same insect. I sat with all of this for a while. My hand kept moving across the notebook page without me consciously directing it. The veil was patient. It did not rush me. I had the feeling that it had given this exact presentation many times and had learned exactly where to pause and let things settle. Then it told me what was different about humanity. It said it carefully, and I want to be precise about how it said it, because it was not a compliment in the way humans usually give compliments, with the warmth and reassurance carefully folded in. It was a scientific observation delivered by something that had been making scientific observations for an extremely long time, and had therefore become very good at precision. It said, "You are still confused." I said, "I am not sure that is a positive quality." It said, "You are still arguing with each other about what you are for, not as a political debate, not as a philosophical hobby, as a genuine unresolved question that drives your entire civilization at a fundamental level. Every war your species has ever had, every art movement, every scientific revolution, every social upheaval, every religion and every challenge to religion has been a version of the same argument. What are we for? What does this mean? What should we do with the fact that we are here?" I said, "And that is remarkable." It said, "Of all the civilizations that have reached us, you are the only one that arrived at the question and did not attempt to answer it by closing. The Solendi closed their borders. The Cathara closed their bodies. 69 other civilizations found various ways to arrive at a fixed answer, to declare the question resolved and to stop growing. You are in your 4,000 years of spaceflight and you are still arguing, still changing, still contradicting yourselves, still producing individuals like you, who cannot stop listening even when the official position is that there is nothing to listen to." It paused. It said, "That is not common. In 71 cases, it has not happened before. We did not expect to see it. We have been waiting here in part to see if it was possible." I looked down at my notebook, pages of it now, covered in my handwriting. The pen had left a slight groove in my index finger from the pressure I had been putting on it without noticing. I asked, "What does that mean for us?" It said, "It means you are the first species we have considered showing the archive to." I asked what the archive was. The veil described it in terms that I will spend the rest of my life trying to translate into language that does them justice. The archive was a record, not a history archive in the Concordat sense, not a collection of documents and censor logs and official accounts. A complete record of everything the veil had learned in their observation of 71 civilizations. Every discovery, every mistake, every piece of physics that a species had worked out and then destroyed itself before it could share. Every moment where a civilization had stood at a fork and gone one way, and the veil had observed what happened and learned what the other road would have required. 15,000 years of watching the galaxy think, and getting it wrong, and occasionally getting it right, compiled into a single accessible form and held here, waiting for the first civilization that arrived at the question and chose to stay open rather than close. I asked what form the archive took. It said, "One that your technology can receive. We have been preparing the translation for some time." I asked how long. It said, "Since your species first left your solar system." I put down my pen. The veil let me sit with that for a long moment. It had known, for the entire span of human interstellar history, that this moment might come. It had been preparing for it before I was born, before my parents were born, before the Concordat existed. For the entire duration of human civilization in space, the veil had been watching and waiting and preparing a gift that it would only give if we turned out to be the thing it hoped we might be. And we had turned out to be that thing. Not because of our fleet, not because of our firepower, not because of our territory or our allies or our technological index. Because one linguist on a signals deck in the middle of a night shift had kept listening when the official position was that there was nothing to listen to. I picked up my pen. I asked, "What is the condition? There is always a condition." The veil said, You must tell your people everything you have seen. All of it. Including the part where we erased your fleet without effort. Including the part where 70 other civilizations chose to close. Including the parts that make humanity look small and frightened and very young in a very old universe. I asked why. It said, because the archive is only useful to a civilization that can look at itself honestly. A species that cannot hear the truth about itself will misuse what we give. They will take the physics and use it for weapons. They will take the history of failure and use it to justify their own choices. They will take the record of what works and only keep the parts that confirm what they already believe. It looked at me with the weight of its full attention. It said, we need to know that you can handle what you actually are before we show you what you could become. I said, and you think we can? It said, you came here alone in a small, unarmed shuttle, and when I asked you why your species arrived ready to fight, you told the truth. You did not explain. You did not justify. You did not offer context. You said because we were scared. That is what convinces me. I closed my notebook. I held it in both hands for a moment. Then I asked one last question. I asked whether the crews of the 46 ships were truly safe, whether I could tell the Admiral they were safe. The Veil said, they are precisely as safe as they were the moment we paused them. Not a cell has changed. Not a second has passed for them. When you leave, we will return them. All of them exactly as they were. I nodded, I stood. My legs were a little unsteady. Calvin Price, behind me, had filled 3 pages of a maintenance log with notes because he had nothing else to write on, and the instinct to document, apparently, was contagious. I looked at the presents one more time. I looked at the thing that had been here longer than human history and had watched 71 civilizations make their choices and had been waiting, with the patience that only something ancient and unhurried can manage, for one that would make a different one. I said, we will be back. It said, we know, we will be here. I turned and walked back toward the shuttle. Behind me, in that vast luminous interior, the Veil was already preparing something it had been preparing for longer than I could comfortably think about. All I had to do was go home and tell the truth. That turned out to be the hardest part. I had 3 days in transit back to Concordat space before the formal debriefs began. 3 days on the Valor, which had been returned to full function the moment my shuttle cleared the passage in the Veil structure, exactly as promised. The 46 ships were operational again, full crews awake and functional and entirely unaware that any time had passed. To them, their instruments had simply reset in a single instant and found everything normal. No gap, no memory, no evidence. Just the quiet, slightly unsettling experience of looking at a clock and realizing it showed the same time as before you had checked. Admiral Harold Crane spent most of those 3 days in his quarters. He did come out once, on the second evening, and he sat across from me in the officer's wardroom with a cup of tea that he did not drink, and he looked at my notebook on the table between us for a long time without asking to read it. Then he said, did it tell you what it is? I said, they is more accurate. He accepted that without comment. I told him what the Veil were. I told him about the distributed intelligence, the structure as form, the 15,000-year observation record. I did not simplify it. I told it the way it had been told to me, with all the pieces in the right order, and I let him sit with the parts that needed sitting with. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the question I had been expecting. He asked in the archive, what does it contain? I told him I did not fully know yet. I told him it was the complete knowledge record of 71 spacefaring civilizations observed over 15,000 years. I told him it included physics, history, developmental records, and documentation of every point where a civilization had made a choice that the Veil had been able to analyze for outcome. He asked, is it a weapon? I said no. I said it clearly and without qualification. He asked, could it be used as one? I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, anything can be used badly. That is partly why they want us to prove we will be honest about ourselves before they hand it over." He looked at my notebook again. He said, "You told them we were scared." I said yes. He said, "And they found that convincing." I said yes. He picked up his tea, looked at it, set it down again. Then he said something I did not expect from him. He said, "I would not have said that." I said I knew. He said, "I would have said something about exploration, something about the Concordat's mandate to secure and assess potential threats, something official and entirely false." I said yes. He said, "That is probably why they wanted you and not me." I said nothing. It did not need a response. He stood up, took his undrunk tea, and went back to his quarters. He sent a preliminary incident report to Concordat High Command 6 hours later. I was copied on it. It was the most carefully worded document I had ever read. It managed to convey the essential facts, all of them, without a single sentence that was technically false, while still somehow making the entire event sound like a controlled and professionally managed first contact situation that had proceeded largely according to plan. I filed my own report as an attachment, 27 pages, nothing managed, nothing softened. We arrived at Concordat Space on the morning of the 4th day. By afternoon, I was in a hearing room. The hearings lasted 3 months. I will not describe them all in detail because the honest description is that they were repetitive and often tedious, and conducted by people who had clearly already decided what they thought before I sat down, and who were using the formal hearing structure to build a record that supported the conclusion they had reached in advance. The charge, technically, was conduct outside authorized parameters during a military operation. The actual concern, which nobody stated directly but which was present in every line of questioning, was that I had made contact with a potentially hostile entity without authorization, and in doing so had set a precedent that the Concordat had not approved. I was not hostile about it. I answered every question. I kept my notes organized. I brought documentation. When someone suggested that the Veil's offer of the archive might be a form of deception, I asked them what deception strategy required 15,000 years of patient preparation for a single honest conversation. They did not have a good answer for that. The lead investigator, a woman named Commander Patricia Halley, was the most rigorous of the panel. She was not hostile either. She was thorough in a way that I actually respected. She read every page of my 27-page report. She had questions about specific wording on specific pages. She asked about the laughter. She asked about Calvin Price's notes on the maintenance log, which had been entered into evidence at someone's request. On the 78th day of the hearings, she asked me a question that nobody else had asked. She said, "Do you believe them?" I said, "Which part?" She said, "Any of it. All of it. Do you believe that they have been watching us for the entire span of human spaceflight, that they have an archive containing knowledge from 71 civilizations, that they are offering it to us in good faith, and that the condition attached to that offer is sincere?" I said yes to all of it. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because they had every opportunity to do something other than what they did. They could have ignored us. They could have removed us the same way they removed the fleet's function and never restored it. They could have communicated with the Concordat through official channels and gotten an official response that had nothing to do with truth. They chose to find the one person on the Persistence who was actually listening and send a signal specifically designed to be found by someone paying attention. That is not the behavior of something running a deception. That is the behavior of something that wanted the right conversation and was willing to wait for it." Halley wrote something in her notes. She said, "And the archive. What happens if we open it and it changes things? What if it accelerates our development in ways we are not ready for?" I said, "With respect, Commander, that is the question of a civilization that is afraid. And as I understand our situation, afraid is fine. The problem is not being afraid. The problem is letting fear be the last word." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Off the record." I said the record could stay on. She said, "Do you think we will vote to open it?" I said, "I think we will argue about it for a very long time, and then we will vote to open it by a narrow margin, and then we will argue about it for another long time after that, and then we will start translating it, and it will be the most significant thing that has ever happened in human history, and we will handle it imperfectly and partially and argumentatively and ultimately well enough to justify the Veil's decision." She looked at the table. She said, "That is a very human answer." I said, "Yes." The hearing panel released its findings 6 days later. Conduct outside authorized parameters, confirmed. Recommended consequence, formal reprimand, demotion to civilian consultant status, reassignment away from active military operations. In the context of the formal record, it read as a rebuke. In the context of what had actually happened, it read as the Concordat's way of acknowledging that I had done the right thing while being institutionally unable to say so directly, which is a very human response to having been proven wrong about something consequential. I accepted the terms. I was no longer Specialist Morrow. I was Consultant Morrow, civilian classification, assigned to the newly formed Veil Contact and Translation Office, which had been created specifically to manage the archive relationship, and which had a staff of 2, a budget that suggested it was being taken seriously while being carefully contained, and an organizational reporting structure that put it sufficiently far from anything with authority that it could do its work without interference. Patricia Halley was appointed director of the office. She asked me to be her senior analyst. I said yes without taking time to think about it. We moved into a set of offices on the 14th floor of the Concordat Science Directorate building in New Geneva, which had large windows and no classified lock level, which told me everything I needed to know about how the main Concordat power structure viewed us. Let them underestimate the office. I had been underestimated before. It had worked out reasonably well. The Concordat Assembly held the vote on the archive 31 days after my hearing concluded. I testified before the full assembly the morning before the vote. I stood at the speaker's position, and I looked at 712 representatives from 43 species, and I told them everything. All of it, not the managed version, not the official incident report. Everything that was in my 27 pages, told in the language of someone who understood that the audience was capable of hearing it, and that treating them as incapable would be the worst thing I could do in that room. I told them about the 71 civilizations and the ones that had closed. I told them about the Solendi in their walled-off silence and the Kethara in their static digital eternity. I told them what the Veil had said about what made us different, not our strength, not our technology, but our confusion, our refusal to finalize ourselves, our 4,000 years of spaceflight still arguing the same fundamental question. I told them what I had told the Veil when asked why we came armed. I told them the Veil had laughed. I told them that the laugh was not mockery. I told them that it was the sound of something that had waited 15,000 years for an honest answer and had finally gotten one. I told them that the archive was real and that it was prepared, and that the condition attached to it was not a test we could pass or fail strategically. It was a test we either passed by being genuinely honest with ourselves or did not pass at all. I told them that 70 other civilizations had arrived here in the history of this galaxy and had all found ways to become less than they were. And I told them that we were, right now, at this exact moment, standing at the fork in the road. The vote was held the following morning. It passed by 9 votes, 712 representatives, 43 species, the largest deliberative body in human history, and it passed by 9 votes. I sat in the gallery and watched the count come up on the display board, and I thought about all the ways those 9 votes could have gone the other way. Then I stopped thinking about that, and I thought about what came next. The archive was transmitted to us 4 days after the vote, through a receiver array that the Veil had provided specifications for, and that the Concordat science teams had assembled in 11 days, which was either an impressive demonstration of motivated engineering or evidence that the specifications had been very clearly written. possibly both. The archive arrived as a data structure of approximately 417 exabytes. That number was not unusual for a database of its claimed scope. What was unusual was that when our analysis teams began working on the index, just the index, the first page of the catalog that told you what was in the rest of it, they found that a single page of the index referenced 3 distinct areas of physics that Concordat science had no framework for, 4 historical periods in civilizations we had no record of, and 1 philosophical framework that our analysts spent 2 days arguing was not a philosophy at all before they realized they were having an argument that the framework itself had anticipated and categorized. That last part caused quite a stir in the translation office. It took 14 linguists and 40 researchers and 2 years to fully translate the index. 2 years for the table of contents. The archive itself was expected to take generations. I was sitting in my office on the morning the index translation was declared complete. Patricia Halley knocked on my door and came in with 2 cups of coffee, which was her version of a formal celebration, and she put one on my desk and sat in the chair across from me, and we looked at the completed index on the shared display without saying anything for a while. Then she said, "How does it feel?" I thought about a night shift 3 years ago, a signals deck, a coffee going cold, a frequency that did not belong in any database. I thought about 5 words addressed to a ship by name by something that had no name in any record. I thought about 46 ships going dark in 4 minutes and 19 seconds. I thought about a luminous interior space, and a presence that was not a creature but was undeniably a mind, speaking in careful, patient tones about 15,000 years of watching civilizations choose. I thought about 9 votes. I said, like the beginning of something. She said, "It is." I picked up my coffee. Outside the window, through 14 floors of Concordat Science Directorate glass, New Geneva was doing what it always did. Loud, moving, arguing, building, questioning, failing at things, trying again. 7 million people conducting the ongoing, unresolved debate about what human beings were supposed to be doing with themselves, and somewhere out there in the other cities of this world, and the 112 other human worlds, and the 43 civilizations in contact with us. The same argument was running in different languages and different registers, but underneath it all the same fundamental question. What are we for? We did not have the answer. We might never have the answer. Maybe the veil were right that the answer was not the point. Maybe the point was that we kept asking. The index was sitting on my screen. 417 exabytes of what 71 other civilizations had learned and lost and left behind, ready to be read by the first species in 15,000 years that had arrived at the question and chosen to stay open. I thought about the veil somewhere out there in a structure wrapped around a star, watching our lights, listening to our noise, watching us argue about the archive with the same attention they had watched us argue about everything else for the entire span of our history in space. Not judging, watching, the way you watch something you find genuinely compelling because you do not know yet how it ends. We had not gone quiet. We were arguing louder than ever. About the archive, about what to do with it, about whether the translation methodology was correct, about what the first piece of physics we found would mean for existing theories, about whether we should send another delegation to NC 7714 and whether I should be on it. I thought I should probably be on it. I had already written the recommendation. Whether anyone would read it this time was, as always, uncertain. But I was going to write it anyway. That was the thing about my kind. We kept writing the recommendations even when the access log read 0. We kept listening even when the official position was that there was nothing to listen to. We kept asking the question even when the question was uncomfortable and the answer was complicated, and the easiest thing would have been to finalize ourselves and go quiet. The noise was the point. I was more certain of that than I had been certain of anything since I found a signal on a dead frequency in the middle of a night shift with a cold cup of coffee and the whole silent galaxy humming around me, waiting for someone to pay attention. I was still paying attention. I opened a new page in my notebook. I started writing.